Hello and welcome to Iowa Homeland Security and Emergency Management's third installment of our applicant briefing series for public assistance. In the first two briefings, we introduced the PA program purpose, key eligibility criteria, the general life cycle of the program, and cost requirements. Today, we're going to cover several things you'll want to consider as your project moves along, including some common roadblocks, compliance with environmental and historic preservation, and hazard mitigation. If you have any questions after viewing this presentation, you can reach out to HSEMD for more information. The PA Bureau Chief's contact info is provided here and again at the end of the presentation. Some of what we're covering is general programmatic issues, such as changes to the scope of work, time extensions, and documenting pre-disaster conditions, damages, and work performed. Some is specific to compliance with federal law. And finally, some is opportunities you'll want to be aware of. Our goal with this presentation is to make your PA grant process easier. We want our communities to maximize what the PA program can offer them, increase resilience, and prevent future damage, and make the process of application and closeout as smooth as possible. We'll start with the more general issues you may come across. Whether it's us, you, or FEMA, we're all human and might miss things. This becomes important when we're signing things, and there's a lot of that with grants. So when you're reviewing a site inspection report, a damage inventory, the damage descriptions and dimensions, the scope of work, or anything else in the process, make sure it's accurate and complete. No one wants something to be ineligible because of an error. Don't miss any deadlines, but take your time to review things you need to sign. Your signature means you agree with the document. Check your damage inventory for any damages missing and make sure the damages listed are accurate. We also recommend double checking the damage site for any damages that were missed before you sign the DI. Don't feel rushed to sign the DI either. The 60 days after the recovery scoping meeting are yours. You should also be aware that it might be edited to meet FEMA's internal standards for damage descriptions. So if changes affect the accuracy of the DI, correct it before signing. The scope of work must match the work you did or do, so it should also be thoroughly reviewed. Whether the work was done and something needs to be rewritten more accurately, or it has yet to be done and ends up changing, your current plans should always match your current scope of work. Another issue to consider is the difficulty in reversing a withdrawal. If you don't apply for funding because you expect insurance to cover the damage, it may still be worth applying for PA in case actual insurance proceeds are less than expected or you want to mitigate an insured facility. It's also hard to go back on a submitted DI after the 60-day deadline. Not impossible, but you'd have to show good reason for changing it. You might later decide you do or do not want to seek funding for a facility, but you need the damage officially recorded to justify it. Additional damages or costs might also be incurred or discovered, which could affect whether you want to apply for PA. Similarly, policies or laws might change and therefore change your decision. Sometimes, if rarely, a clarification from FEMA or a change in cost share will mean a project that did not seem worth pursuing now is. Even when we get everything right at the beginning, sometimes things change, whether it's the timeline, community needs and resources, or project details like materials and costs. When that happens, we need to update the project, and this should happen as soon as possible. If the work completed doesn't match the scope of work, funding may be jeopardized, especially if it bypassed a EHP review. We'll discuss EHP later. Whether you decide to add mitigation, switch to an improved or alternative procedures project, upgrade under codes and standards, discover new damages, add or remove work, change materials or equipment because of availability, or just spot an error, the scope of work must match the work. Even if the total project cost does not change or even decreases, a scope change will be necessary if elements in the scope of work change. If deadlines do not look doable, time extensions may also be granted, and often accompany scope changes, weather delays, supply chain issues, additional disasters, etc. Time extensions should be requested at least 30 days prior to the current work deadline. These requests, as well as scope change requests, should be submitted in EM grants and include detailed justification and documentation of the reasons for the change. With these grants, it is not better to ask for forgiveness than permission. If work continues or finishes before requesting a scope change or before it is approved, You may experience delays or even loss of funding. On that note, here are some of the reasons you'll want to stay between the lines when you're working with FEMA grants. If a recipient or applicant fails to comply with any term of the PA award, FEMA may take one or more of the following actions: temporarily withhold cash payments, deny the use of funds and matching credit for all or part of the cost of the activity not in compliance, completely or partially terminate the current award, withhold future grant program awards, or take other remedies available. FEMA has to make sure that all the work that they're paying for is the result of a declared disaster. So they need documentation to show that damage didn't exist prior to the incident. Documentation is a little different for every facility, but it should help show that aside from the fact that damage didn't exist before, the damage was not caused by a lack of maintenance or negligence. FEMA will not pay for damage caused by neglect or deferred maintenance, so you might have to show that you maintain the facility regularly. Maintenance records do not always have to be specific to the damaged facility if it can be shown that you take care of similar facilities. Another issue you may run into with pre-disaster conditions is when roads are damaged by heavy vehicles removing debris from the disaster. Across the country, applicants have had their projects denied because they could not show the conditions of the road prior to the debris removal. We recommend taking pictures before the work begins if possible, or regularly taking photos of your roads. We get it though. Sometimes taking photos just wasn't on your mind when dealing with a major disaster. So what can you do if you don't have any photos? Some options might seem more obvious than others. Google Street View might show what you're looking for, or you might find pictures in a newspaper or on a website that showed, for example, the opening of a building or a parade on a street that was damaged in a flood. Similarly, members of the community might have taken pictures, whether of the disaster itself or photographing something else that was included, or something else that included the facility. Local law enforcement might also have dash cams or body cams that could show pre-disaster conditions. Most damage may be easy to spot, but some sites that were inaccessible or hidden when damage was recorded might have potential damage. This can still be added later with justification, e.g., the facility was still underwater or drywall was removed during repair, which showed new damages. When photographing damages, you should make it clear what the photos are showing and where they were taken. What's in the picture, what's the location and direction you're looking, what's nearby, or where does it lie relative to other landmarks. When dealing with dozens of photos, it can be helpful to caption these photos to keep them straight and to explain. There are also apps such as Solocator that can help record this for you. To summarize the tips for general issues we've covered, know what you're signing, review the details and correct it if it's wrong or if you disagree. If you need more time, ask for an extension sooner than later. Keep HSEMD in the loop. We're on your team, so let us know if project scope or details change, or if you want them to. If time is needed, if you receive inconsistent information, or if anything is unclear. Provide documentation if you can, but if it's not immediately available, be creative in finding ways to show pre- and post-disaster conditions. Save anything that can strengthen your case. Our next topic is environmental and historic preservation, generally shortened to EHP. Every project in the PA program goes through EHP review, so it's important to be aware of issues that may come up. Many reviews are quick and painless, but some projects may present issues that need a closer look. FEMA is required to follow state, local, and federal laws that protect history and the human environment. To meet this requirement, FEMA will check if your project has impacts on water quality, air and noise, vegetation and wildlife, especially endangered species and their habitat, debris storage, reduction, and disposal sites, environmental justice, socioeconomic and cultural resources, hazardous materials, geology, historic properties, archaeological sites, properties with sacred or cultural significance to tribes, and floodplains and wetlands. The National Environmental Policy Act requires federal agencies to consider the impacts of their actions on the human environment, including biological, physical, social, cultural, and economic impacts. Consequently, FEMA reviews all their projects to ensure compliance. Some projects, however, fall under categories that do not require review, whether by regulation, called categorical exclusions, or CAT-X, or statutory exclusions, known as STAT-X. If you're restoring a facility essentially to pre-disaster conditions, you won't need a NEPA review. Other projects that usually have little impact on the environment, if any, will probably fall under a CAT-X too, although FEMA will check for any unusual circumstances and other laws may still apply. Other projects might need more time to get through EHP review, sometimes adding months to the timeline. This is uncommon in the PA program. We'll discuss what prompts EISs on the next slide, but if one is needed, you will need to coordinate with FEMA prior to conducting the environmental review, and you must then submit the results of that review to FEMA before beginning work. You will need to arrange for the environmental review, but this is an eligible cost that FEMA can reimburse if the project is obligated. At the recovery scoping meeting, EHP staff might be able to give you a general idea of what issues may come up, and once the scope of work is written, they'll review the project and issue a record of environmental considerations, or REC, giving you the conditions that must be followed. EHP staff are also available to help throughout the project development process. Issues that could necessitate an environmental assessment, or EA, include if the project engenders a public controversy, the work can impact endangered species or habitats, historic properties or wetlands, the materials on the site are potentially hazardous or polluting, or if cumulative impacts of human activity are significant. If the EA shows the potential for significant impacts, an environmental impact statement, or EIS, will have to be prepared. FEMA will also check to make sure that you have any permits needed for the project. When you apply for a permit and when you get a response, you should document it. Even when no permit is required, for example, because the project falls under a general permit, you should document compliance with that general permit. Typically, these are permits from the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, or DNR, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, or USACE. You can look at their websites for more information on whether your project requires a permit. You may find the DNR's PERMT site linked to here especially helpful. If your work is in or near or may affect a body of water or a wetland, you will most likely need to check with DNR and the Corps. The DNR will generally also require permits for staging debris and disposal, including construction and demolition or vegetative debris, open burning or projects that could affect air quality, development in a floodplain, which will also need to be coordinated with the floodplain manager, if applicable, excavation and fill, or repairing or replacing regulated facilities such as water supply and wastewater treatment, landfills, pollution, discharge points, etc. This list is not all-inclusive. Similar to NEPA, the National Historic Preservation Act requires federally funded projects to be reviewed for potential impacts in archaeological, historical, or cultural areas and artifacts. To meet this requirement, FEMA works with the Iowa's State Historic Preservation Office, or SHPO, along with about 24 tribal historic preservation offices to ensure that these are protected. While Iowa only has one resident federally recognized tribe, historically many peoples have lived here and have a cultural or religious interest in Iowa's sites and artifacts. While every project will be reviewed, certain factors will cause FEMA to take a closer look at PA projects. Namely, facilities that are located in floodplains, are being relocated or expanded beyond the original footprint, or are more than 45 years old, i.e. they have a potential for placement on the historic register. Facilities that have exceptional significance, facilities that are on the historic register, and work being done near archaeological sites. Also similar to NEPA review, a deeper NHPA review can add weeks to a project with a minimum 30-day consultation period. Again, depending on the project, it may not be an issue. We don't want the potential length of these reviews to prevent you from pursuing projects that will be best for your community. So for assistance, please reach out to SHPO at their website here or your HSCMD representative. A few things are common causes of headaches for applicants, which we'll go over now. Disturbing undisturbed ground is inevitable sometimes, whether you're demolishing, expanding, or relocating a facility, or just clearing debris, sometimes there's no way around it. But given that it can complicate your EHP review, we would recommend you avoid disturbing new ground if possible, while still achieving your recovery and mitigation goals. Ground disturbance can unearth unseen hazards or archaeological artifacts, which must be reported immediately to the state archaeologist. If human remains are discovered, work must cease and it should be reported to local law enforcement. SHPO and HSEMD should also be kept in the loop. Even stump removal is considered ground disturbance, so we typically recommend cutting stumps flush with the ground instead. Creating temporary access roads and burying utility systems will also be ground disturbance. Undisturbed ground is broadly interpreted, so avoid assuming something is already disturbed. It may be better to work on a clearly previously disturbed ground, such as pavement or an old building footprint. Demolition of facilities can also present unique environmental hazards. Basements and foundations may need to be filled, removed, or modified to allow for drainage and ensure safety. Utilities such as wells, pipes, electricity, sewer, septic systems, etc., will need to be capped. Depending on the facility, there may also be hazards present in the demolition debris, such as asbestos, lead, or pollutants from underground storage tanks. And special care must be taken to ensure safety and proper disposal. If the work is not already done, you will likely see these requirements in your record of environmental considerations. If it's already complete, you may need to address some of these issues after the fact. The Endangered Species Act requires FEMA to ensure that its projects do not adversely impact endangered species or their habitats. Two impacts to be aware of are tree removal and setting up power lines, which should be reviewed for impacts on Indiana bats, northern long-eared bats, and the whooping crane's migration corridor. Working in rivers and streams may also impact the endangered Topeka shiner, and thus may require special measures to mitigate harm to those populations. The state of Iowa also recognizes over 100 threatened, special concern, and endangered species that might be considered in project development. A common pitfall when it comes to the EHP review is debris management. Since debris removal, staging, and disposal can have an impact on all the issues already mentioned, endangered species, demolition, ground disturbance, pollution, etc., FEMA follows the impacts of debris from cradle to grave, meaning the place the disaster deposits it to the place where humans dispose of it. Debris staging is not a simple thing when it comes to EHP, because depositing debris on a site, even temporarily, can cause harm to environmental and historical resources. Here are several recommendations to make EHP review go smoothly. First, use previously disturbed ground, such as roads, paved lots, or sites set aside for or previously used for debris. Maintain distance from property boundaries, water, floodplains, wetlands, structures, wells, and septic tanks with leach fields. Treat it like a regulated burn site. Check with DNR about using the site for debris and get a permit if needed. Then document compliance with any permits. Also check with your floodplain administrator. When disposing of debris, make sure you record where the debris went, which landfill, burn site, salvage, or recycling service, and where it is located. FEMA likes GPS coordinates if possible. Also consider that if you plan to burn the debris, you will need to comply with the Clean Air Act, which is administered and permitted through the DNR. Some supplies, such as sandbags or HESCO barriers, may also become debris if they're contaminated by floodwaters and should be handled and disposed of accordingly. Finally, be sure to document your debris removal, staging, reduction, and disposal. Record locations, amounts, costs, hours, volunteers, etc. Pictures will help to confirm the amounts and locations, making the process go more smoothly. EHP concerns can delay and/or jeopardize your funding, but they don't always have to. Make sure you're aware of EHP concerns from the start. When a disaster is declared, FEMA will create what's called a green sheet, which gives information on EHP issues that may come up for that particular disaster. One way to avoid extensive review is to stay within the footprint of the old facility. However, if relocating, expanding, or improving the facility is the best choice for the community, be aware of EHP requirements from the start that can help speed the process. There may be previous studies done by the city, county, state, or other entity, including your own, that could cut out some of the costs of conducting them. For example, if an archaeological survey was already conducted for a neighboring site, or a hydrologic and hydraulic study was performed for a culvert replaced upstream. Make sure your project lays out the plans for any ground disturbance, including perimeter and depth. Designate sites for debris staging ahead of the next disaster. Your FEMA program delivery manager will ask you for these too, but you can be prepared with accurate GPS locations for all project sites and debris sites, year of construction for facilities, and where any fill material, gravel, or other material are coming from. If anything changes, let FEMA and HSEMD know right away so that EHP can have time to review. Finally, document everything. You'll hear it often, but it's essential to show compliance when questions comes up. We'll move on now to our last topic, PA mitigation. Mitigation is essentially long-term resiliency, protecting people and property from natural hazards. In the context of disaster recovery, we're talking about repairing such that this doesn't happen again, or if it does, losses are minimized. This funding is only available for permanent work projects. So category A, debris removal, and category B, emergency protective measures, can't include mitigation. Some examples are using stronger materials, elevating, burying, or floodproofing utilities and facilities, straps, guy wires, braces, tie downs, anchors, etc., to secure roofs, poles, and structures, protecting or strengthening doors and windows, or adding redundant utilities to prevent loss of service. The federal cost share for repairing to pre-disaster is going to apply to any mitigation work as well, with some caveats that we'll get into. Why is FEMA paying for this? The National Institute of Building Sciences has found that for every dollar spent on mitigation, we save $6 down the road. This is long-term resiliency. There are 4 criteria you'll have to meet for mitigation under PA. First, the work has to meet the usual PA eligibility requirements and directly reduce the potential of future damage to the damaged portion of the facility. Second, it has to be technically feasible and effective. It also has to be cost effective, which we'll get into in a minute. Finally, it has to comply with all relevant laws and policies. A note on protecting the damaged portion of the facility from future damages. The mitigation measure does not necessarily have to be part of the damaged portion. For instance, if your basement flooded, you could protect it with a perimeter flood wall. It doesn't have to be part of the basement. On a case-by-case basis, FEMA will also consider mitigation for undamaged but interdependent elements of a damaged system. So if 10 of your 20 windows are damaged in a storm, you may be able to strengthen all 20 windows, since the loss of any one can cause damage to the building contents. Similarly, if only a few power poles go down, the whole section is dependent on them and might be eligible for upgrades. Also importantly, the mitigation does not have to be against the same type of future damage. So if you have a tornado come through, you could mitigate against high winds, but also against flood, drought, fire, heat, ice, etc. These policy points are somewhat new to the PA mitigation program, so look for opportunities to make your facilities more resilient with these in mind. The cost effectiveness criterion can be one of the more complex factors in mitigation. There are 3 ways cost effectiveness can be shown. First, the 15% rule says that any effective mitigation measure that costs less than the 15% of the cost to repair to pre-disaster conditions is eligible. The denominator here is only the costs being protected by the mitigation measure though. So if, for instance, you're only elevating 2 of your 3 generators, the cost to replace the 3rd generator is not included in the calculation. The next option is called the 100% rule, which is calculated the same as the 15% rule, but with a limit of 100% of the repair costs. The caveat is that the measure has to be listed in Appendix J of the Public Assistance Policy and Program Guide, aka the PAPA G. Some measures commonly accepted under the 100% rule are not explicitly listed, for example, by falling under the or similar other measures clause. So even if what you want to do isn't listed, it could still be worth a conversation with a mitigation specialist. Finally, if your mitigation proposal does not fall under the 15% or 100% rules, as long as the benefits outweigh the risks, it can still be shown to be cost effective with a benefit cost analysis, a BCA for short, which FEMA calculates and validates through an Excel add-on. Benefits factored in include reductions in damage to the facility and its contents, the need for emergency protective measures, the need for temporary facilities, loss of function, and casualties. This process will likely require more documentation from you, but it opens up many opportunities that would be closed on the first two rules. Note that these are all calculated prior to any reductions for what insurance covers. So if you get $100,000 in damages and insurance covers $80,000, the 100% rule would still be up to $100,000, not the $20,000 that FEMA considers eligible. Also note that if something does not come in as cost effective, you may be able to shift some of the mitigation work to your own costs through an improved project. This would mean FEMA still pays for mitigation up to what is cost effective, and you would cover the rest. The process for PA mitigation can begin before disaster strikes, or if you have mitigation you already want to do for the damaged facility. Otherwise, mitigation should be brought up by FEMA and/or HSEMD in your exploratory calls and recovery scoping meetings. But if not, ask about it. Mitigation specialists will look at your project and consider mitigation opportunities they find, in addition to any you suggest. After discussing and deciding on an option, FEMA can write the hazard mitigation proposal, or HMP, or you can. You may have to provide some further information at this point, including cost estimates, historical damages, demographics, etc. The HMP will be included in your scope of work, so if you decide not to go forward with it, you'll need to amend the project, either before signing off on the project or as a scope change request later. Mitigation must be performed as written in the project. You or contractors will do the mitigation work, and then when the project is closed out, HSEMD and FEMA will verify that it was done. Now, you may be familiar already with mitigation under other FEMA-funded programs that HSEMD manages, including the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, or HMGP, Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, or BRIC, or the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program. We want to distinguish PA mitigation from HMGP specifically because they are closely tied in recovery work. PA mitigation is for protecting damaged portions of existing facilities, while HMGP can technically be for existing facilities as well, and can be used for undamaged portions of damaged or undamaged facilities as well, which is useful if you want to upgrade the whole thing, but PA only covers part. HMGP can take longer to go through, but you also have as much time as you need to write an application, whereas PA mitigation is part of your recovery timeline. Perhaps the most important difference is that if your facility is eligible for PA funds, it is automatically eligible for mitigation. Conversely, since only facilities eligible under PA are eligible, not all counties are eligible in every disaster. Under HMGP, the funds are limited and therefore projects compete for these dollars. The state has to set priorities to manage the limited funding. Meanwhile, if you are eligible for PA mitigation, you can choose what mitigation you feel you need, even if the costs are so small they would hardly be worth the time as a separate HMGP project. Some PA mitigation has been as little as $100. These smaller projects can also be done without a BCA, whereas HMGP will always need a BCA. Another difference is that PA may be able to cover mitigation that you performed when repairing even before you talk to FEMA. HMGP has to be submitted, approved, and funded before any work can begin. Finally, the money spent in PA, including mitigation measures, dictates how much money is in HMGP. So the more communities mitigate under PA, the more we can mitigate under HMGP across the state. In most cases, for every dollar you spend in PA, a federal dollar comes to Iowa for HMGP. Mitigation is a great opportunity for communities to protect life and property, but there are some things to be aware of so that it goes smoothly. First, don't forget to include EHP. EHP has to review work being funded, and mitigation may require more scrutiny. There is an exemption from some review for projects that build back to essentially pre-disaster conditions, but mitigation might include moving or expanding businesses or buildings, thus disturbing new ground or posing new impacts to historical or environmental resources. We always recommend talking to your FEMA and HSEMD contacts to make sure EHP is considered for your mitigation. Another potential roadblock is the cost effectiveness requirement. If you need to run a BCA, extra documentation may help to show historical damage or potential loss from future disasters, but sometimes this information is hard to find or create. Sometimes this extra work or the local cost share of the mitigation itself might seem cost prohibitive. If it does, please reach out to HSEMD. We may be able to help you find a way. As mentioned earlier, some policies surrounding PA mitigation have been updated recently. Consequently, old information might still be floating around, including in the minds of the applicant, FEMA, or HSEMD staff. Resilience is the buzzword nowadays, and it is a priority for FEMA and HSEMD as the frequency and intensity of disasters continues to trend upward. Finally, you may run into the issue of already having done your repair work without mitigation before you applied for PA funding. While FEMA won't pay to undo or redo any of that work, they will still cover the cost of mitigation that you decide to do after the fact. What we want you to come away with regarding mitigation, firstly, is just to talk about mitigation with your PDMG or HSEMD representative. Second, since cost effectiveness is calculated before reductions for insurance, if insurance covers all or most of your damage, the facility may still be eligible for a significant amount of mitigation funding. Don't discount an opportunity just because you think you won't need it. You won't need FEMA dollars to repair it. Third, HMGP or Section 404 mitigation funding is dependent on how much is obligated under the PA program. Consequently, the more we mitigate under PA, the more money Iowa has available for life-saving and money-saving facilities and infrastructure. Planning ahead for mitigation can make it easier to decide on mitigation after damages make a facility eligible. Recognizing flood-prone or wind-prone facilities, bridges or culverts that should change in capacity, or identifying locations for flood walls, rain gardens, blue or green roofs, and doing some of the planning work ahead of time means less delay for mitigation and EHP considerations and less time-stressed decision-making. It's also important to note that if you already completed the repair work before you considered mitigation, or even if you performed mitigation while doing the repair work but hadn't yet applied for PA funds, it can still be eligible for mitigation. Finally, you want to be sure that what's written in your project is what you want to do. Sometimes HMP's hazard mitigation proposals might be missed or not marked as accepted, or details might be off. If anything in your written project is not what you wanted to do, including if your plans change, let HSEMD and FEMA know before you continue any work. Thank you for your time today. I hope this presentation helps your recovery process go smoothly. We are available if you have any questions or need clarification. You can find our contact information on this slide, and your HSEMD representative is also available to help.